Test, 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 test. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Test, test, test.
Oh, Patrick.
Come to tiredness at the end of town. George said she was being a bit hideous and she thought she needed her to go to bed.
Do a sound test on it.
I'm going to test it.
Sorry?
I'm going to test it.
Okay.
You're on.
Okay.
The sound's on.
Right. For those watching on YouTube, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We're just giving people a few more minutes to arrive and to get to their seats, and then we'll get going. So we should start in about 5 minutes, and don't leave YouTube. Thank you. Am I on there? Okay, that's lovely. Right, hello everybody. Thank you so much for coming this evening. If you'd like to take your seats, we'll be starting shortly. Thank you. Right. Yes, love.
I'm really pleased that you're not playing a right back.
Oh, thank you.
I really am, because we were talking to Jill, and she sort of thought, they thought that you were gone.
No.
And turning my phone off. I've done that one before. I was in court, and my phone went off. And oh my God, you know, it was the most awful times. I'd never done it since. Yeah, so I'll find out when they can get together. We all get together.
Okay, that would be lovely. That would be really nice.
Have you seen them recently?
What about last week? Because Jill's teaching Tom maths.
Oh, is she?
Yeah, so she sees him twice a week. Yeah, homework and everything.
That's good.
So, yeah. So, but we will do. We will definitely get
I'd
together.
like to, before you go,
Oh, definitely.
before you escape.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
There he is.
Without a shadow of doubt.
Hello.
All right.
Hello, Patrick.
How are you?
Really good.
Let me see if I got my stuff down there.
Patrick.
It's in here.
Right.
Do you want to sit down for this bit or stand up?
I'll ask you questions. I'll ask you questions.
So this is just the introduction.
Yeah. I'm here. And I'm turned on. Am I turned on? Yeah. Hello everyone. Thanks for coming here tonight. This is Coward. She's going to talk about her book, Blood and Bandages. Can you tell people a bit about it?
Yes, certainly. Blood and Bandages is a Second World War memoir of a nursing orderly called William Earl.
And when did you start writing it?
This project started in 2010, so it's 7 years in the making.
Wow. And it's an amazing book about an army medic who took care of injured soldiers, but and before that you used to be a solicitor.
Yes. So writing is my second career. I was a lawyer for about 8 years, and then I switched over to writing, and found my love of storytelling. And so you'll find there are lots and lots of stories in Blood and Bandages.
And you've done a couple of screenplays, haven't you?
Yep, two of my short films have been produced, and I think the biggest claim to fame was in 2013. I wrote Alison Lapper's contribution to the What Makes Us Human series that was broadcast on Radio 2.
And I heard it, and it was absolute.
Thank you.
Shall I let you get on now?
Okay. Thank you very much.
If I could. Thank you.
All right, so I'll take that from you. Okay. Where would you like to sit, Patrick? you want to sit here, Patrick? Excellent. Well, as Patrick said, thank you very much for coming this evening. We've got a small select crew, but everybody who should be here is here, so that's absolutely fantastic. So thank you for coming. I want to do two things when I talked about Blood and Bandages. First of all, I want to give you a flavour of the book, and then I also want to talk about the writing process. So the first half will be extracts and slides, and the second half will be the pitfalls and the lessons I learned as I went through. I didn't intend to write Blood and Bandages. It started off as a blog, and I always describe it as a blog that got out of hand. I met William by accident in 2010 when he was around at my in-laws' house, and he was watching the cenotaph celebrations, or commemorations rather, and he was talking about his time in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and I was listening, and it was a tale that I'd never heard before. And the more I heard, the more I was intrigued. So I asked my mum-in-law to fix up a meeting so I could do a blog on Bill, because I tended to do blogs on veterans in November. And when I met him, he was 96 years old, lived independently, still does, and he met me with the words, "I am a D-Day dodger, and I still hate Mark Clark for what he did at Anzio." And the moment he said that, I thought, this man has clearly got passion and fizz, and he's somebody that I really want to get to know. So I had an hour to meet him, and during that hour he explained what he did during the Second World War, and it was quite clear at the end of that hour that he was desperate to carry on telling his story. So we carried on meeting, and then after a while I realised that it was way beyond a blog and this needed to be made into a book, and with his agreement we said that we would create a book. So what I had to do first of all is check to see if William Earl was in fact the man that he said he was. So let me just, I'm new to this, so that's me, so that's Blood and Bandages. So this is William Earl at age 30. When we got talking, he told me that he was born in Suffolk in 1915. He moved to London at 16 and joined Boots, where he was a chemist assistant. And that was an absolute key decision because that defined his life in the army from there on in. In 1937, he met the love of his life, Mary Standen. And he admired her from afar for 2 years until in 1939 they actually started courting. And he was still courting Mary when William was called up just after Dunkirk in May 1940. And I'm going to read to you what he said when he was called up. "I thought I'd struck it lucky when I got my call-up papers. I'd been ordered to join a field ambulance in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and in those days we all thought that a job with that lot was safe and easy. I thought I'd just be a male nurse and pick people up and carry them about on a stretcher. Had I known what a field ambulance actually did, I'd have been terribly upset. It was just like being in the infantry, but without a rifle." And what he was describing was his experiences here. Now, well, that's the pointer there. Now, this is the whole chain of evacuation for the Royal Army Medical Corps, and this was taken from the manual in 1935. And if you see, that's the front line up there, okay, and there you're looking at base hospitals down there. So that's your safe area down here, and that's your danger area there. And this is where William was operating. As you can see there, you've got the troops in the line, then the RAP stands for Regimental Aid Post, and what would happen would be the injured would be collected by stretcher bearers, regimental stretcher bearers, and brought back to the various regimental aid posts. There they would receive rudimentary medical treatment, and then it would be the nursing orderlies from the Royal Army Medical Corps that would be going forward from the advanced dressing station to go up to the RAPs to collect them. And the method of collection was any means available. So that could be a stretcher, it could be a blanket, it could be on their backs. Any way possible they would get these men back. They would bring them back to the ADS. There they would receive slightly more medical treatment, but essentially speed was of the essence. They needed to get these men back. So ambulances would be waiting at the ADS. They were driven by the Royal Army Service Corps, and they would ferry them back to the main dressing station, which was the extent, that was the headquarters of the field ambulance, and that was the extent of their areas of operation. So when William says that he would have been very upset had he known what a field ambulance did, he'd be absolutely right, because this entire area here was under fire. At this point they were under rifle and machine gun fire, at this point they were under artillery fire, and that would probably go right the way back here. Now the men in the field ambulance, their job was to treat, collect and evacuate the wounded and to bury the dead. A field ambulance was allotted to an infantry division and they had to follow them in the field of battle. That's why they're a field ambulance. They were so important that if there were too many casualties in a field ambulance, the infantry division that it supported, infantry brigade it supported, would be taken out of the line. They'd be taken out of action. It operated under the Geneva Convention. So when William was being trained, it was drilled into him that he was there to treat, collect and evacuate all the wounded of all nationalities. There was to be no distinction whatsoever made between any of the combatants. The Germans did the same thing. So if the Germans came across any Allied wounded, they would also be treating, collecting them and evacuating them. And William always said that the medical men had no enemies. And that was right. And the Germans often, well, mainly observed the Geneva Convention. So if they saw a whole string of ambulances moving through, they would cease fire. And William also describes an event in Anzio, when it was virtually trench warfare in Anzio, where there was no let up in the fighting. So what the medical men did then when they were standing in a trench is actually two of them would stand up when the firing was going on, they would hold up a red cross and they would stay standing up, holding up the red cross until the firing stopped. They would then go out, they would go and rescue the wounded, they would come back to their trench, they would lower the Red Cross flag, and then the firing would start again. And they did this morning and evening in Anzio. The key to a field ambulance was its mobility. Because it was following an infantry brigade in the line, whenever that infantry brigade moved, the field ambulance had to move with them. And the photograph I showed you earlier of Mary, you can see up here, you've got, it's a defaced, well, it's a damaged photograph, and you can just make out that that was probably drawing pins. And that was because sometimes William had to move so fast that this photograph, which had stuck on a wall or on a post, had to be taken down so quickly he didn't even have time to take out the drawing pin. He just ripped down the photograph, bundled it in his possessions, and would get going. Now, the nursing orderlies like William were very highly trained specialists. In their training schedule when they first joined up, they would cover anatomy, physiology, camouflage, hygiene, various different triage, all sorts of different medical procedures, because they weren't paramedics, but they had to be as best trained as they could in the field, because they had to know who to collect, how to treat them, and how to safely evacuate them. They had to be extremely fit, because they had to be able to move unconscious casualties from the battlefield with their kit and with their rifle. And if you think when you're going onto the battlefield, some of these men would be in extreme pain, so they had to move them carefully when they were trying to move them as well. They had to have a demonstrable inclination to treat the sick, And when they first joined up, they would come from all sorts of fields, often chemist assistants and pharmacists. But they would, as they went through their training, their commanding officers would actually test them to see if they actually had the compassion to do the job that they were meant to do. And if they didn't have that compassion, they would be weeded out. They had to be able to act on their own initiative, because there'd be some circumstances, and I'll read you an extract later on, when they get separated from the main body of men that are trying to find the wounded. And so they have to decide what they are going to do and how they are going to do it. They also had to be very calm under extreme pressure, because as I've said, this area here was under fire. And in some circumstances, when they're moving the men back from the regimental aid post back to the advanced dressing station, they will come under fire. Normally a soldier that comes under fire will hit the deck. He'll dig a strip trench and will get down. When these men were moving the wounded on stretchers, they couldn't do that. They couldn't drop their casualty and run for cover. They just had to keep going. So they had to remain calm under those circumstances. But it doesn't mean that the men that were enlisted adapted easily to their new life as military men. They were civilians. They were civilians that came from a medical background that were enlisted into the army. William, I mentioned earlier on, his decision to become a chemist assistant in Boots, that defined that he went into a field ambulance. In his intake, there were 96 members of 96 men that came in to start the field ambulance, to join the existing field ambulance, and the bulk of those were chemists and chemist assistants and pharmacists. So when William joined up, they still had the attitude of being medical men first and foremost, and they sometimes ran into difficulties with the rules that they had in the army. And this is what he said: "We were all connected through health and medical work, so we were all equal. Therefore, we didn't salute officers when they walked by. We just said hello and got picked up for it." And you can see that the Part 1 orders, which are basically daily orders that come through when men are training, you have a commanding officer that's getting increasingly exasperated by the fact that these men aren't adapting quickly enough to military life. And he will say, he's often sending out orders saying, "Do not stamp your feet noisily during drill. Do not ask other people to do your duties for you. And do not stand in the middle of the road at night and hail a vehicle to stop." So you can get a rough picture of what was going on in the camps. And this is what William said about his training. "There were lots of do's and don'ts, and we hated it. We used to meet up in groups and say, 'What did you think about that?' Or we'd go up to the sergeant and say, 'What have we got to do that for? Why can't we do it this way?' Unlike the staff sergeants, the new sergeants were pharmacists, so they were our former colleagues. Some were great, and you could talk to them man to man, but others would get on their high horse and pull rank and bark, 'You can't say that. You're in the army now.' They tried to treat us like we were in the infantry, but we weren't in the infantry, and we weren't like the infantry. We viewed ourselves as civilian medical men first, and soldiers second." Despite that, William did well in his training. He passed his Class 3 nursing orderly exams and moved on to the harder Class 2 nursing orderly exams. And in the summer of 1942 was told that he would be going overseas. His response was immediate. He wanted to marry the love of his life, Mary Standen. And they set a date for the 29th of November 1942. He had 5 days leave, and on the eve of his wedding day, he left her a note which he wanted to be opened on the wedding day itself. And this is what he said: "Dear Mary, when you get this, my darling, I shall be at the church waiting for you to claim you as my own forever to the whole world. I am gloriously happy. No one could be more happy than me, as very soon, darling, you, the most glorious and most wonderful girl alive, will become my darling wife. I do love you madly, and always will. So, darling, I wait for you with all my love and all I possess. Always and ever yours, Will. 6 months later, William left for overseas. He left Mary and their young son David and did not return to England for 3 years. The entire 56th London Division, of which the brigade to which he was attached belonged, they left Liverpool, went up to Glasgow and joined a convoy that had to cross the Atlantic in the height of the Battle of the Atlantic. There were 5,000 men on board HMS Franconia II. The men travelled in one convoy, their arms and equipment in another. And the reason for that was that if a convoy was attacked by a wolf pack, they would either lose the men or they would lose the arms, hopefully not both. One of the convoys was attacked. Luckily, it was the one holding the equipment, and the men survived. They didn't find out about that until they landed in South Africa. And then they realised that they were a division without arms, which was totally useless. So they then spent, I think it was up to 6 months, getting rearmed and retrained before they reassembled in the desert and zoomed across to join the 8th Army in the dying weeks of the North African campaign. This is what William said when he went into battle for the first time on the 23rd of April, 1943. We clambered onto the lorries and travelled alongside our ambulances at the rear of the convoy. We hung back because if we got too close to the infantry, we could get caught up in enemy fire. As we trundled along the dirt track, we wondered what was going to happen and how we would react when we went into action. Would we cower away? Would we be afraid? Would we be cowards? Would we risk our lives? None of us knew what we would do. Reinforcements were an obvious enemy target, so as we got closer to the action, the Queen started to spread out and we slowed down. The Axis forces opened fire the moment they spotted our troops, and the advance stopped. When we looked out from under our flaps, we were horrified to see that 3 or 4 of our ambulances had gone ahead and had got mixed up with the infantry. We looked on helplessly as we saw our ambulances get caught in the middle of a shelling zone. We later learned that when the firing had started, one of our comrades had been so scared that he had frozen to the spot. A shell detonated beside his ambulance and shrapnel tore through its skin straight into his body. It was very sobering to know that before we'd even gone into action, one of ours had been killed. When we went forward again, the mood in the lorry had changed. All we thought about was keeping together, helping one another, and looking after each other so that we had a greater chance of survival. This gives you an idea of what the men actually were facing when they had to recover casualties. So you've there got a rescue from a tree, under camouflage. Bearing in mind, these rescues are probably under fire, across water, and from high-rise buildings. Sorry, that's Mary. That's Frank. Sorry, I've skipped a few slides here, so I do apologise. Now, William's great friend was Frank Allen here. That's William there and Frank Allen there. This is just before they went into action in Tunisia. Frank worked with William all the time, and Frank was a very calming influence on William. And the scene I'm going to describe to you is when he went out with Frank after a battle and they had to look after the casualties and wounded. We never knew what type of injuries we would encounter. Sometimes we would find a soldier screaming in agony because half his leg had been blown off. Other times, we'd attempt to carry a man, but when we grabbed his arms, one of them would come off in his hands. Some men were so badly injured, all we could do was to make them comfortable and leave them there to die. It was grim, but it was what we'd been trained to do, and I felt that if I couldn't do that, then I shouldn't be doing this work. Of course, a big part of our job was to hide our feelings. It would have been unforgivably cruel to show shock, horror, pity or revulsion in front of the injured, especially those who had cried with relief when we arrived. But there was one thing that really turned me over: trying to remove the tank crews from brewed-up tanks. We could do nothing to help those burned men, half men really, and the sight of those poor souls was nasty, really nasty. It was different with the infantry. Their injuries were often less cruel, so they had more chance of survival. We fought hard to save them, and the quicker we could get them back to the advanced dressing station and the main dressing station, the greater the chance they had. But what surprised William as much as anything was the long periods of waiting that he had. Although they were under fire, there were often times when they couldn't go out and retrieve those men. They had to sit in a trench and wait. And it was at those points that William brought out a chess set. He had made a little chess set before he came out from England, and he had taught his great friend Frank Allen the game. So these two men used to sit in their trench with the shells going overhead, waiting to go out and retrieve men like that, and to calm their nerves, they used to sit there and play chess. And on one occasion they were playing chess and they were so involved in the game that they heard a thud nearby, didn't investigate, and only when they're given the all clear to go to leave the trench did they check, and it was an unexploded bomb that landed right beside them, and they'd just been merrily playing chess whilst this bomb was sitting there. Three days before the Axis forces surrendered on the 12th of May 1943, which signalled the end of the North African campaign, William was involved in a night mission, and this gives you an idea of the calibre of the men in the Royal Army Medical Corps. They'd only been in action for 10 days, and they all knew that night missions were incredibly dangerous, because the only thing that protected the men of the Royal Army Medical Corps was their Red Cross brassards. That was the only thing. They didn't have any weapons, that they were non-combatants. And at night time, nobody could see their Red Cross brassards. So when they went out, they often went out in small groups because then they were less likely to be spotted. And they tried to go out in groups of 6 or 8. The bigger the group, the more likelihood there was that they'd be mistaken for an infantry raiding party. And with the incident I'm going to describe to you now, 18 of them had to go out because they had a call through that there were men missing in no man's land, and they had to go out at night to try and rescue them. And I'm going to read you an account of what happened on that night. And when you hear this account, bear in mind these men have only been in action for a number of weeks. During the search, A1 section, that's William's section, bumped into a German patrol, which attacked them with hand grenades and then made off. Sergeant Abley rallied the section, with the exceptions of Privates Sherwood, Mustoe, Palmer and Gillian, and with the help of some regimental stretcher bearers, continued the search. After the attack, Private Sherwood and Mustoe were together, but separated from the section. Nevertheless, they continued according to their original orders and found a wounded soldier of the Oxen and Bucks and a regimental stretcher bearer. they attended to the man, and the three of them carried him on a stretcher back towards the regimental aid post. On the way, they were attacked for a second time, and a grenade burst immediately under the stretcher. The regimental stretcher bearer and Private Mustoe were wounded, and Private Sherwood could not find the stretcher or the original casualty. Private Mustoe was unconscious, and in Private Sherwood's judgment, mortally wounded. He did what he could for him: dress the wounded regimental stretcher bearer, and then carry the latter on his back to the regimental aid post, a distance of 1.5 to 2 miles. During the whole of the return journey, there was incessant shell and mortar fire and some sniping. When they returned from the mission, Private Sherwood and Sergeant Abley were recommended for the immediate award of the military medal, which they got. The saddest thing of that account isn't the fact that men were killed when they were being rescued, because unfortunately that's a fact of war. The saddest thing is that when the men were teamed up to work together, they were teamed up because they got on really well, just like Frank and William. So when Private Sherwood left Mustoe behind and took a stranger back on his back, he left his friend behind, and he knew his friend was going to die. So he had to make that heartbreaking decision of leaving his friend that was mortally wounded or a stranger that had some chance of survival. So these men in the Royal Army Medical Corps not only were incredibly brave, they had to be slightly detached because they had to be able to make those decisions. It didn't mean that they felt any less. They just had to hide those feelings and just carry on with their job. When the battle ended on the 12th of May, so only a day or so after Mustoe's body was found, William joined an Anglo-German advanced dressing station. As I said at the beginning, the Germans and the British worked together. They didn't have any enemies. So at the end of the North African campaign, the Germans and the Brits worked together at an advanced dressing station to deal with the wounded. And William said that there he realised that the men that he was working alongside were just like him. They had been called up, they had no choice, they had sweethearts and wives and children at home. And that there was a bond that naturally kept them together. And he also said that one of the highlights of that particular mission was that he tasted sauerkraut for the first time. And he thoroughly enjoyed that. Well, at the end of the North African campaign, William felt that he was completely, he was battle hardened. He could deal with anything. And then, of course, he was sent out to Italy. And unfortunately, I've run out of time, so I can't talk about the Italian campaign. But you'll hear a story of, as William goes through, he landed in Salerno 25 minutes after the assault troops landed in Salerno. He was at Anzio. He was on the foothills of Monte Cassino, and he was going through the Gothic line until eventually he survived the war and was one of the first troops to actually get into Venice when peace was declared. Now that's about blood and bandages, and I'd like to share with you now, very briefly, the process of writing Blood and Bandages. As I said at the beginning, I had to research this matter. First of all, to find out that William was actually who he said he was, and that was easily done. You just check the army records for that. And then I had to check to see whether his account was accurate, whether at 96 he could actually remember things as clearly as he seemed to. So I went and did a sort of general sweep of what happened in the North African campaign, and I was staggered to see that in some cases William's recall was only a few days out. So at 96 I realised that I had gold dust here with William. So then I went on to look at the field ambulance records. Now that's at the National Archives, and the National Archives are an absolutely fantastic source of information, and they had all the war diaries for the 214 field ambulance, William's field ambulance. So I photocopied all of that. I photocopied all the information from the sister field ambulance that worked alongside, because sometimes if the records were missing for the 214, I could see where the 167 was, and I knew that they were going to be within half a mile of each other, so I could guess what was happening and what they were doing. I also looked at the divisional records, and then the 8th Army, and then the Anglo-American 5th Army, and then the war as a whole. So the reason this book took 7 years to do was the amount of research that went into it. That research then had to be organised. From the National Archives, I had 1,000 photographs of all the documents they had there, and each one had to be documented and cross-referred with the account that William was giving, letters home, photographs, anything, so I could see exactly where William was at any one time. And in that process, one particular moving thing happened was that I had a letter from William, because Mary, his beloved Mary, kept all of William's all of William's letters when he sent them home. And William didn't know that until Mary had died and he found them in her papers. But in one of the letters, he was saying, "Oh, darling, we're on the sea now, and all we're doing is looking out on the sea and dreaming, and we're just so happy that it's so quiet and so peaceful now, and we have a good bed to lie on and some food. And I do so wish I was home. The only thing I'm living for now is to come back to you." And by going through the war diaries, I could track when that letter was written. And that letter was written after the Battle of Anzio. So when he says it's all peaceful and all quiet now, I can put into exact context what he meant by that was that they weren't being bombarded every second of every day. And at that point, he was sailing out because the Black Cats had been decimated and they had actually been sent out to Egypt. And he was writing that letter from on deck on board the ship that was taking them out to Egypt so they could be re-equipped and reinforced. And it's things like that that allows you to put everything in context. The thing about research is the more you do, the more you have to control. And it was very easy to get extremely involved in all the stories that I was reading in the war diaries. And I had to keep on telling myself that this is William's story. This isn't anybody else's story, it's William's story. And I managed to sneak in Blood and Bandages. You'll see that I've managed to sneak in little accounts of what other people were doing. And the reason for that wasn't because I'd forgotten the main story was William's, was because what they were doing was more interesting than what William was doing at that moment. And at the end of the day, I like telling stories. So if I can see a better story, if I can justify it, I'll put it in. Right, well, I think I've exceeded my time now. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening so patiently. Sorry about skipping through the slides there. All this newfangled new technology. Not used to it. So please forgive me there. But if you have any questions, please do ask. Thank you very much. Okay, yes, please.
It's not really a question, it's just lovely to hear such a description because my father was wounded in the Battle of the Bulge, and he described being evacuated on the brim. You said about whatever means possible to get away, and he was on the back of on the top of the brim, and he remembers the pain of going over the ground and going through, and then being treated in each station, being patched up, and blood. The whole thing about the Second World War as opposed to the first was that they had blood transfusions, they had antibiotics, and he described so much of what you just said. I've never heard it documented like that. So thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Your father must have been a very brave man. Any more questions?
Well, that was where my father was, in all those places.
Really?
He wasn't a medical man, he was a Royal Engineer. And he was in all those places.
Oh, that's
Ended on that.
really.
Yeah.
The Royal Engineers were really interesting actually because they used to clear the minefields as well when they went through. So they were incredibly brave men. They had a great sense of humour, the Royal Engineers too. And I was reading some of their reports. One thing I must say actually, William sends his apologies. He did hope to be here tonight, but unfortunately he's 102 now, and his eyesight's deteriorating a bit, and so he has to have injections in his eye. and he had an injection yesterday and felt that he wasn't really up to coming tonight, but otherwise he would be here. Any more questions, or are you ready to adjourn to the bar? Well, thank you very much. It will be up. Okay. Thank you.